Good morning, everyone. Thanks for coming. It always is a bit astonishing to me that after the long nights and the parties, of which there were many, there are so many people so early in the morning, relatively early in the morning. We have a topic that I think is very well suited to our location, which is building Asia's new museums. I think it's very appropriate. This is a city where you can't get from A to B without going through a construction site. I think the whole continent is in a permanent construction mode, reinvention mode. The whole spirit of this location is about reinvention, building the new, creating something new. Let me first thank our speakers. I'll just mention them by name more in a minute. Stephan Schütz of Gerkan Marg partner in Berlin. Young Zhao from his own practice in Dali, and Kjetil Thorsen of Snøhetta, based in Oslo. Please give them an applause for their thoughts that are coming. Thank you. They've been very nice to come all the way here, although they're no strangers to Hong Kong and to these parts. I also want to thank Art Basel for doing this. You know, this is an art fair. This is a trade show in many respects, but it's also has become a kind of intellectual platform for sharing ideas. This is where we in our world come together, and so it's great that resources are invested into a kind of intellectual side of all this. And we should be thankful to the Absolute Art Bureau, which not only helps make these happen, but records them and makes them available online. Ladies and gentlemen, we are in the midst of the most extraordinary museum building boom, focused right here in Asia. As many of you know, these museum booms tend to sort of go in bursts, and so I'm going to give you a very simplified history. First came, of course, Europe's great museums, installed very often in royal palaces, aristocratic homes, great public works of architecture, echoing a kind of classicist language, certain assumptions about high culture that Europe had, and that boom cresting in the sort of 19th century. Then came America's century, the American century of museum booms, and I think it's fair to say that America left a very strong mark on what a museum is and what a museum building is. Think of the Guggenheim, for better or for worse. Think of MoMA, think of Marcel Breuer's Whitney Museum. These buildings and their architects express something very American about museums, which now lives with us, more democratic, more open, more educational, more transparent. And now, in the last 20 years or so, I think there's a kind of another museum boom of sorts, which I think is worth mentioning, which is the Star Architect museum boom, probably dating back to the Pompidou in Paris and, of course, to the Frank Gehry's Bilbao Guggenheim. These are museums that, again, have redefined what museums can be or what the impact of a museum can be. A magnet for tourists, a magnet for white-collar workers, a magnet for international attention. I think it's fair to say that after Bilbao, everything changed in terms of why cities and nations build museums. And here in Asia, and especially in mainland China, there's been another element that's been feeding museum buildings is the idea of soft power. The awareness that museums can sort of say something about a country, that they can project benign and progressive ideas to the rest of the world. Today, architecture is a very, very important component of museums. No longer do we simply install museums in existing buildings, but there's a kind of expectation that the star architects are part of the process very often, and you know who I'm talking about: Renzo Piano, Richard Meyer, Herzog de Meuron, Zaha Hadid. These are all architects whose names, whose brands have become sort of fused with the institutions that they build, which now stretch from Abu Dhabi to Mexico City and from Helsinki to Sydney. Here in Hong Kong, of course, M Plus is being built. One of its finalist architects is here with us on the panel. Hello, Kjetil. And that will soon be announced. He's not at all nervous about this.
Not at all.
And this is part of an extraordinary picture over on the mainland. In the art newspaper this week, there was an update on museum construction in China. In 1978, there were 348 museums in China. Now there are 3,400. Under the current 5-year plan, 1,000 museums are being built in China. The largest of these museums was built by the gentleman to my right, the National Museum. There are now 175 government-run museums dedicated to art. Yesterday alone, there were 30 private museum owners. Maybe some of you are here in the room today, meeting here at Art Basel. We have a creation of a whole new museum ecosystem that is unfolding before our eyes. But although these numbers are very impressive, I think it's fair to say that many questions loom over this big new chapter of museum construction. Let me just mention some of them, because I hope we'll cover a few of these, which is, who are these museums for? What sort of collections and exhibitions will they house? What experiences and functions should they provide? What messages do they embody and signal to the world? Can or should Asia's museums be different from those in Europe? And how in the United States? How will this new museum infrastructure shape communities and nations? What impact will it have on the fabric of the society? What, in any case, should a museum be today in this age of globalism and the networked society, a building full of objects? What is its function? And I think very importantly, from a political standpoint, is a museum an agent of change, or does it reinforce the status quo? So I think in all of these, for all of these questions, the role of the architect is absolutely pivotal. There's a tremendous opportunity and also, I think, a tremendous responsibility that these gentlemen have in answering these questions for us. So I hope we'll touch them very briefly. If I want to sort of offer one headline or premise for today's conversation, it would be that just as Europe and America have left their stamp on museums, it is inevitable that China and Asia will leave its stamp on our understanding of what museums are. So it would be really interesting to grapple with what that will mean and to explore all the challenges and opportunities. So enough of me. We're going to launch into a little conversation at the end of which there will be opportunities for questions. I want to say right now that if you will ask a question, there's simultaneous translation that will need to happen, and it would be very nice if you could mention who you are and which institution you're from, and I guarantee you there'll be time for questions at the end and also to mingle afterwards with our guests. But for now, I'll just sort of get us going with a question to each of you very briefly, and we'll see how we can go from there. And I think we'll start with you, Jan, because, well, I think it's only appropriate that you're the first to speak. You studied architecture here as well as at the Harvard Graduate School of Design. Yeah. And you're very young, of course. You've established your own practice here. You're working on a number of projects. One of the ways you came to our attention is that you are currently this year the protege of the Rolex Mentor Protege Award. And you're working very closely with Sana and have been doing very interesting work in response to the tsunami, and haven't yet built a museum, but from our conversations, I know you have strong ideas about it. You also won a famous architecture award in 2010. So when we talk about museums and architecture, what is sort of top of mind for you?
Well, first, thank for this invitation and for the question. That I think museums, first of all, is like it's a response to there's a consensus of the society to build a civilized society. I think that's the first point that came to my mind. So the idea of architecture is to keep this consensus as a basis to start with.
What do you mean by civilized society?
I mean, first it's like what we call generally about to bring the whole society to a more happier stage of life. Mm-hmm. So that's the idea or the aspiration to improve this. Mm-hmm. And culturally, I think as a cultural facility, museum has this function to help it. Mm-hmm.
Do you see museums in Asia so far delivering on that promise?
Not at all. Actually, I'm quite disappointed about it, especially in mainland China, because what we see, as you mentioned, there are like already 3,000. Yeah. But I don't really feel that, because most of them are just not related to people's life, I mean cultural life. So we can see more and more fancy-looking or even stupid-looking buildings emerging. But you know, they are more like just a statement of appearances, like showing off the idea of the government or the power of the capital. But it's not really about providing a pleasant public space or cultural facilities for people to enjoy. So that's the big challenge, and also that's why I'm very disappointed, and I don't really know what's the solution to that, actually.
How much is that a failure of architecture, and how much is it a failure of the client?
Excuse me?
How much is that the failure of the architects, and how much is it the failure of the clients that are dictating the terms?
Well, it's hard to see, because well, I mean, it's an integrity. I mean, the reality first, and the emerging of this the need for museums is because of everything, because of politics, because of the economic growth. So there's this like a collective desire to make new stuff. So there's the architects who desire to make new fancy buildings. There are also new clients, and the more and more powerful governments and richer and richer governments, they want to make this happen. So it's very hard to say who is responsible for this not very ideal situation.
Well, Stephan, you have been, how many museums have you done in this country already?
4.
4?
Yeah.
You have been inside these relationships, and I'm so glad you were able to join us today. Actually, we got to know each other shortly after you completed the National Museum in Beijing, which indeed is, I think, still the world's largest in terms of floor area. And your firm in Germany has been one of the leading architectural firms for vast infrastructural projects, airports, rail stations, public facilities, and has been very active in China, completed more than 80 projects. So you've really had a broad experience in the region. So you've also built some churches and some schools and all around the country. So the National Museum project itself was an 8-year, more than 8-year project. So picking up a little bit on what Jan was saying, what's your observation about museum construction on the mainland in particular, and why do you think this disconnect is happening between the public and museums so far?
I think that I totally agree on what you say and what you think about the status quo, that the museums are not public spaces and that they are mostly not pleasant spaces right now because the content is missing. It's just, let's say, an empty box, what we see in lots of Chinese cities. But I think we should see the general development in China first. We have a rapid growth of economy, and we have a growth of urbanization. People come from the countryside, they go to the big cities, they build vast areas of apartments. This building boom is mostly a residential building boom in China, and together with this boom of residential buildings and office buildings, there came the museums into the cities, more than a planned object, then they are really needed. For example, there is in most of the museums you do not find a collection or something. It's not the necessity to build a museums because there are so many art pieces or something like that. It's something like you said, the Bilbao effect. They want to have this Bilbao effect, and that's why the interest of the clients and of the governmental institutions is mostly focused on how the building looks like, rather than what is in the building, what goes on in the building. And the heroic time of this development was when we were invited for the competition of the National Museum, together with Herzog de Meuron and Foster's office and Remcola's office. That was the time when China prepared for the Olympic Games. That was the time when they prepared for the Expo in China, in Shanghai, sorry. And but now we see a shift, because economic also goes slightly down in China. They have the program still to build such a lot of museums for the people, but I see that right now that we are much more talking about content, the sense of a museum. So I give you an example. We won another big competition for a national museum, the National Museum for Arts and Craft. It was in 2010. We did the design, everything was fine, and we thought we can start the project right away as the National Museum. But they stopped us, and since 2010, I'm invited in expert meetings and public discussions to discuss about the sense of this museum. What are we going to do with this museum?
You mean there were public discussions?
Yeah, there are public discussions.
People involved in that?
Yes, yes. And our client is organizing that. And we did not do any step in the design. We just discuss about the sense of this museum. Maybe this is an exemption. Maybe this has to do with
what I was going to ask. Do you feel that this is that we can sort of say to the audience that there's sort of a new trend, and maybe this is going to be a good point to bring in Kjetil, because you're going well. I mean, it's a different situation here in Hong Kong, but do you think that there's an evolution? I mean, so often we observe about China that what existed 5 years ago is not necessarily what's happening now, and that there are learnings that happen. I mean, are you seeing more consultants being brought into the process, and do you think that's a general shift?
There is a general shift. I see that clearly when, for example, we talk about in a competition jury, we talk about the design. They do not accept these big size spaces. They are not so much interested in how the building looks like, but what the organization of the the distribution of the function are, and so on. So they come deeper to the content of the museums. That's what I see in the last 2 or 3 years.
Well, that's a hopeful sign. So Kjetil, you're co-founder of Snøhetta, a wonderful firm. Many of you know it. Probably one of the most influential cultural buildings of this century. The Oslo National Opera is one of your iconic and influential designs. In New York, the city where I live, you're about to open the pavilion for the 9/11 memorial. So to say that you've been working on projects which are in sensitive points and which are sort of emblems of their communities is an understatement. You're also working on a project in Saudi Arabia. You're very close to art. You worked with Olafur Eliasson on a project at the Serpentine. So as you look out on this landscape and with the observations so far in mind, what's your feelings about the Asian museum evolution?
Well, I think I have a similar approach to what has already been mentioned, in effect. Well, to me, museums, similar to many other cultural buildings, are really institutions rather than physical objects, in a way. And I think if we manage to design the institutions themselves, how they're organized, how they're supposed to be run, establish internal cultures in how human constellations are within these museums, then we might have a possibility of designing museums for the future. I think museums, though, are objects of liberation, in a way. And I think it's extremely important to see that in changes, specific changes in society, museums have always taken a lead, you could say. It's the way of, we see the same in Saudi Arabia, you know, where we have a very strong and very hard religious drive in one direction. How do you actually go about when you want to liberate people in a sense that they meet things within themselves they didn't know they had? You know what I'm saying? You're sort of being confronted with parts of yourself within this institution that is somehow embedded in you, but you have nowhere to go to actually mirror that particular situation. So I think one should be careful on one hand to undermine sort of what we've been asking for, like Winnie the Pooh for many years. We want both, you know. We want everything. But we should be careful to say they will not have, these buildings will not have a long-term function. One of the great things about spaces is that they can change functions. We've seen that happening throughout ages, you know. So I think sort of climatized space as a shelter, per se, is maybe the more important aspect of creating architecture. Still, today, 2013, than maybe very, very specific relationships to what you actually want to portray. I feel more comfortable, you know, it's like Italo Calvino in the discussion between Marco Polo and Kublai Khan saying, culture is the keystone of the Roman arch. If you remove this keystone, societies will collapse. So I'm a little more in the direction of saying, the more the better, in a way. Independent of whether we like it, whether it's aesthetics, whether it's politics. I mean, if you read Rancière, Politics and Aesthetics, you move into a situation where you say, there is no differentiation between these two things. So what you actually do is you dive into something unknown. And you're creating and you're building. Okay, maybe it's bad, maybe it's ugly, maybe, you know, but does it really matter?
I remember a few years ago, I was at a panel discussion in Dubai, and it was about museums in the UAE. Many of you have followed the story. And it was a group of well-meaning Western museum people, and there were people from the Emirates there. And the Europeans said, well, you know, why are you going to have collections? Are you going, you know, why are you doing this? And a lot of complaints were voiced. And at a certain point, a very distinguished-looking gentleman, Emirati, got up and said, hold on a minute. You know, we've just invested billions of dollars into culture instead of war and armies. You know, give us a break. Give us a few years. You know?
Right.
You know, I think that there's a little bit of this going on. Coming from the United States, I'm always struck by how 100 years ago the Europeans looked very condescendingly at American museums. You know, plaster casts, copies of European sculptures at the Metropolitan. How gauche. Now it's the Americans' turn to look down on the Asians and say, oh, you know, so there's a kind of cycle, right? But the question that I have for you is, if a museum is a liberating institution that has this power that you speak of, as an architect, how do you, on the one hand, work for the most powerful and entrenched forces in society, but provide an institution that is an agent of liberation?
Well, I think there is a lot about creating certain types of flexibility and adaptability, you could say, long term. So let's say you would create a museum almost like a master plan, rather than a building, which would mean you would have to include public space, you would have to include everything that is directly in relationship to building like that. That would give us the possibility of programming for an unknown art future. Because there's no question that contemporary art museums will have to be designed for art not yet produced, right? Yep. So if you don't allow for that, which you don't know, then how can you design, unless you have a historical museum, which is slightly different, but let's talk about contemporary museums. What would happen in a case where you put a lid on the possibilities of the future? That would ruin every type of contemporary development, wouldn't it? So it's more deliberating in the sense that it is 100% accessible, that it is completely interactive with the city it operates within, and that it can change. I mean, the first things we've seen when directors come into buildings where we didn't have a director, like the library in Alexandria, was the first thing you do is to rebuild the building. Yeah. I think it's great. I mean,
Stephan is nodding very intently.
but still, even that makes sense.
Yeah. Well, I mein, with that in mind, I mean, I think this is a beautiful idea that you're actually inventing a building for a culture that doesn't exist yet.
Yeah.
So let's sort of move on. And I think we've affirmed a couple of important themes that give us a baseline for the conversation. But let's explore this future culture and your role in it. I kind of want to understand where you're coming from as individual people. What are your touchstone museums and why? I want to ask each of you. I mean, if you had to single out a museum that you believe is a truly great work of architecture as a museum, what is it and why? Maybe I'll throw it to you.
For me, as a Berliner, it's the National Gallery of Mies van der Rohe. And I would like to explain why it is so.
Yes, me too.
It is the perfect empty box. It is perfectly accessible for everybody. 4 sides, it's just a glass box, it's protecting roof, and the curators, the artists, they have to deal with the building. This building was for a long time a problematic, it's a problematic building because you cannot expose art in it. But since a couple of years, they start working with the building. The building is interacting with the art installations installed in the building. And therefore, this is a perfect museum. It's not a perfect museum in a conservative way. It's very hard to deal with the building. But that makes it such a fun to go to it and to see the different installations.
Yeah, I think it's like someone very powerful with a very vision into the future made such a powerful statement, and everyone afterwards have to do a conversation with it when you want to make an exhibition inside it. So that makes the building very fantastic, I think. That's the case of Mies van der Rohe. I mean, in my case, I think there's a series of small museums I visited, which is developed by a foundation in Japan called Benissei Holdings. In the Seto Inland Sea, there are several islands. They invited like and Tado Ando, Sejima, and Nishizawa to make several small museums. What's fantastic to me is that these small museums, they are very well integrated into the landscape, into the nature, and the way they exhibit art has a very intimate way for people to relate art with nature, because and also in the case of Inujima, which is developed and designed mostly by Sejima, she put many small buildings among those old traditional houses of that Japanese village, and you almost don't really notice when you encounter these small buildings, but they have such a subtle touch on your mind. I think And this is incredible to me because it's like opening another vision of museum, because they are not really about creating objects that are very cutting edge looking. They're just making environments. And this environment has to be seamlessly related to nature and related to the human life. I think, to me, this is like the future of museum, of public spaces.
Integration with nature.
Yes, yes.
Your turn.
Well, I would have to approach this, of course, now from a slightly different point of view, because I would have to talk about the institutions that I like rather than the buildings, right?
Right, you just have to stick to your guns, yes.
I mean, looking at that, I think it's a historical museum, but one of my greatest museum experiences is the old Egyptian museum in Cairo. Yeah. First of all, there is a certain density on the object side, and you dive in, and all of a sudden you're being confronted with things that are 15, 20,000 years old, and they're right there, and you can touch them. And it's sort of completely interactive. It has really no ambition apart from the fact that it actually wants to show these objects in a very, very limited space. So I think, you know, when they're doing now the new museum out at the Giza Plateau, I think to some extent it would be a pity if they didn't preserve that museum as an artifact. You know what I'm saying? It's sort of just leave it exactly the way it is and use all the new stuff, the other stuff that they don't have on exhibit at the existing museum in the new museum, and leave sort of the museum as a museum exhibition part in the city. The other one is, if I'd say, well, I don't disagree with the Mies van der Rohe. You know, also the pavilion, the pavilion in. Huh?
You do not.
He said he doesn't disagree,
Okay,
which is a little bit of a, you know, he doesn't quite agree.
Yeah, it has to be put both ways, as you know.
Right.
But if you go and have a look at the Houston pavilion by Mies at the Fine Arts Museum, similar things happen when they start building the walls inside the glass walls for it to be able to exhibit, which means there's still a transparency, because the non-transparency is temporary. So in a way, there is this beauty between opening up a window and then closing it and taking it away. As we usually say, it's easier to cover up a window than to build a window afterwards, you could say, in architecture. The other one is the Van Gogh Museum before it was redone in Amsterdam. Not because of the beauty of the building, again, but because of the exhibition and the space that you have between every picture. I mean, to me, it's the speed of experiencing art is extremely essential. Personally, I need a fair slowness in my possible perception of this art. So that museum actually gave me the slowness that I needed not to get tired, let's say. Where the light flickering and sort of the amplitude of the light didn't turn me off, let's put it that way.
Well, you know, I think it's really interesting that I mean, the values, you all are clearly in your answers returning to certain values that you feel are important to museums. And there's some overlap, although there's also some contradiction. I mean, on the one hand, all of you are saying that it should be a flexible and accessible institution. You want it to be contextual and organic in a certain way. Although at the same time, you also like strong architectural statements, as I guess architects would. So, I mean, if you wanted to boil it down to, you know, if there was a message to this, you know, for the 500 next museums in mainland China, you know, of what values they should most embody, would these be the ones, or is there something else? And how do you work in that direction? Because I think, frankly, to be honest, most museums are not. They do not necessarily represent these values. They tend to be very defined experiences, very structured, not very responsive for the most part to their environment. Present company excluded, of course. But so how, you know? So what is it that you most would like to see in this next phase of museum construction? What values should these institutions express above all?
I think as we see that for the time being, there is no clear idea about the operation of these museums, and there are no curators, no directors taking care for what happens in the museums. The advice should be they should be as flexible as possible. So I told about the empty box. It should not be seen as a critic. Maybe this could be a great advantage, just to make it as simple as possible, so that many people, many future generations of curators and directors can deal with these boxes and can put in their ideas and their concepts.
But that's a very restrained position for an architect to take. I mean, most architects, I mean, if I think about a house, usually the architects I know, you know, they have very clear ideas about how I'm supposed to live in that house, or what a good life is.
Oh,
I mean, don't you get frustrated that you're just building this box? Wouldn't you like to have some influence on what happens in the box?
I think there could be wonderful boxes. I was talking about the National Gallery of Mies van der Rohe,
yes,
which is without any doubt the best box ever. And why should we criticize that?
Right,
it could be great.
Yeah.
There's a story about Mies van der Rohe and another famous German architect, Hugo Hering. They lived together in one apartment, and Hugo Hering was doing these organic spaces which fit like a tailor-fit suit to the user. And Mies van der Rohe always told him, why do you do this tailor-fit spaces? It's not necessary. Just do it the double size and make it generous, and do not think about the use of the house right now. It will, as you told it will change. It should be flexible. That's the best thing.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, to some extent. I mean, still, you know, if you, I think we're going about planning museums maybe in a wrong way, and that starts at the very beginning. I think in the involvement of the city. Let's say these are political decisions, obviously, and I think to some extent it's not enough to make a political decision. Well, if we moved all the way back to the Nolli plans of Rome, say, and started looking at black and white drawings where everything that is white is public and everything that is black is private. And you don't distinguish between indoor and outdoor. So everything that is white is public, whether it's indoor or outdoor. Now, if you imagine Hong Kong as a three-dimensional city drawn that way, with that sort of drawing, giving it its basic relationship, which is the division between private and public, the city would look completely different than if you do a master plan looking at the buildings per se. So I think it's the basic studies of accessibility and underlining future democratic policies, you could say, which is equality, all these beautiful words that we're using, but they mean something. They're not taken out of the blue, and I really believe museums are political statements in the sense, and if they're done the right way, they're involving the public. You look at the city from a different point of urban perspective, and then you can start evolving the public spaces that are necessary in relationship to museums.
And in your personal experience, how do you manage that discussion? I mean, how do you bring a mayor in a fast-growing Chinese city, for example? How do you navigate that dialogue to get to these very enlightened ideas, which have taken us 150 years in the West to arrive at these ideas? So how do you manage this?
Well, in our case, we would talk to any stakeholder that would support us. So, yeah, whether it's the mayor or whoever it is, what we see is that decision-making is based on ways of being led there, you could say. Advice, good advice. Who are the advisors to a mayor, for instance? Who would he invite in to come and help him to establish a museum?
Mm-hmm.
We would talk to these people. We would involve the public. We would have like Ground Zero. You know, public meetings with Republicans, Catholics, Muslims, Jews, Democrats, policemen, firemen. There would be up to 120 people in the room. And they all have different opinions. Well, that's great. So in the end, then, for instance, Ground Zero, like many other museums, becomes sort of a negotiated architecture, which I, to some extent, believe can lead to form, because it's politically informed. That doesn't mean that it is less aesthetic, or doesn't have a beauty. There is no contradiction, but you work with, and you try to change the politics of how you look at this, and that you do by talking to all the stakeholders.
And you're also trying to model a certain idea of politics for it.
Completely.
Have you been able to organize things in this way in your own works, in your respective areas?
I think, to come back to your question, the most important thing is not to start with a picture. I mean, we all know that our clients, especially in Asia or in China, they just want to see pictures. If you start explaining, you are stopped after 1 or 2 or 3 or 5 minutes, and they will tell you, please show me the picture. And I think the most important thing is that you take your time and explain about the concept, the keywords. For example, accessibility, public space, the context and the interaction of the museum with the context, if there is a context. For example, if we talk about China, we hardly have a context, because they start their urban development mostly with a public building. They started on a flat, broad nothing, and they built the museum first to say, okay, we are here, and now investors, please come to build your apartment houses, offices, and so on. So it's hard to talk about the context if there is really no context. But actually, the most important thing is to create or generate a sensitivity to these key issues which we discussed before. And then, of course, you have to open the box and show the pictures.
So the challenge is becoming really rough, because you're building an institution for the future in a situation where there's no context.
Right.
So that's pretty, the bar is set high.
Yeah.
So
that's why the empty box is a good answer.
An empty box devoid of concept for a future culture. So that's tough. But this is why you have the world's best architects on this panel. It seems to me that everything we're talking about actually boils down to ethics and choices. And decisions are made using public resources about the future and what society should be like, and what urban life should be like. So, and you're part of this decision making. Are there any red lines that should never be crossed? Are there situations where one should just say, no, I won't do it?
Yeah. Don't you think?
Well, there's always a zone of negotiation.
Yeah, but
this is a typical Chinese answer.
That is true.
yeah, I think there is a certain there is a breaking point for why you should do something, because in whatever you do, you're spending your time doing it. So you have to make a judgment whether I like to spend my life doing that or that.
Yeah, yeah.
So in a way, there is a choice, yeah, and there has to be. And I think that choice differs from architect to architect and practice to practice. But saying if you can't involve yourself on and within the things you're actually so strongly or you believe in, then if that goes contrary to what you believe in, then definitely you should say no. We do. Yeah.
So you've been in that situation.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think it's important to do it because you feel so damn good in the morning.
Yeah.
Right. I want to just maybe talk a little bit about this whole China effect, if you will, or Asia effect, and the idea that we said earlier, which was that inevitably all these museums will reflect back on what museums are. And I wanted to ask you, I mean, to start with, as you look at the Western museum tradition, is that a model that really can be applied here? Does it need to be modified? Does it fit with the sort of Chinese idea of interacting with art, in your view? And if not, then how does it need to be changed? Or how will it change in this soil of this cultural soil?
Yeah, that's I saw as the second problem, even the biggest problem than the former one. I think it's not about the content of a box. Maybe now we don't have enough content to fill into these boxes, but that's not the problem. The problem is the box itself, because I think the Western art is about to be exhibited in these perfect, almost abstract boxes, and it's pretty much enclosed. And when you get in, you are just confronting this art. And but in a more Chinese situation is that, I mean, traditionally we do not appreciate art this way, because, for example, those old literati, when they have art in their houses, they always have a garden, for example. They have pavilions, they have corridors, and they invite friends and to have tea, to have a walk inside these gardens. And at the same time, they have those arts objects like paintings beside them. So when they appreciate art, there's always a very intimate relationship with what's happening outside. So that's intimacy. That intimacy with nature is very important in this Chinese way of looking at art, I think. So I think there's a big difference between the Chinese culture and this Western culture. So I think this is something more critical to be thinking.
So first we dispense with the present, then we dispense with the context. Now we take away the box. I mean, now it's really, really getting hard.
There's nothing we can do anymore.
But I think that's a very, very profound point, because I think, our heritage is to take that, comes out of the Enlightenment, separation of nature and culture, take these objects of erudition and learning, put them in a box, put them in a gallery with a wall that separates them from, that's an artificial space identified as a space of culture, because it's precisely in opposition to nature. And that's our tradition. What you're saying, you're precisely the opposite idea of interaction, where the idea of contemplation happens in a natural context. That throws a lot of architecture out, museum architecture out the window, right?
Yeah, I think in this Chinese culture, the art itself is not that important traditionally. I mean, it's very integrated into everyday life. So it's not like something you can take away from your everyday life and put it somewhere else and look at it. That looks even quite ridiculous to a very traditional Chinese mind. I mean, so I think this is something we have to think about if we want to do a museum in China in the future.
So what conclusions does that lead you to? And these gentlemen from Europe, what conclusions does it lead you to about new forms or new typologies of museums? I mean, where would you suggest things should go on from here, from the box, out of the box?
Well, it has to be, I mean, the idea of looking at architecture should be to conceive it more as an environment instead of as a physical existence of these walls or ceilings. So the point is that when we get into a building, it's not like getting into a container. It's like getting into an environment where you do not feel the separation between a garden or a room. So I think in imagination, that's the ideal environment for appreciation of this traditional Chinese art.
1 second. How many people have questions? Just so I know. Okay, we have a few. So how do you respond to that? This is a different way of thinking about museums.
I think that's a very valuable thing what you mentioned, because we are European architects. We come to Asia, and we want, of course, we want to bring some ideas from Europe to this country. But at the same time, we have to understand that we have a completely different culture, a different way of displaying art pieces and using a museum. And I think we can learn a lot from it. We should have this sensitivity for the space, for the culture we are working in. Of course, it's also good to have some new ideas from other countries. I mean, we are living in a global village, but I think this cultural exchange, what you said, the cultural handshake, could be done in a museum, could be done on the subject of museums. And so I guess museums in China anyway will look different from those ones in Abu Dhabi or Oslo or wherever, because there should be, or there must be, a certain interaction with the local culture, with the local tradition. I had a lot of discussions about that on the National Museum in China, which was a quite complicated thing. But I learned a lot about this culture during these years.
How has 20 years of working in this context changed your kind of modernist European perception of architecture? I mean,
it has changed a lot because because we are discussing. If we want to do successful projects, we should be a partner in dialogue with our clients, with the institutions we are building museums or whatever public buildings for, and therefore, if you have a let's say a determined style or predetermined idea about what a museum should be, and you are not able to have a conversation, to have a dialogue and exchange, then you won't be successful in a way that the museum is successful for the people using it.
Now you actually spent a lot of time turning museums and institutions inside out. How do you resonate with what Jan was saying?
No, I think this is perfect. Like I said earlier today, I think this water surface is a fantastic museum, which we have right outside this window. You know? In a way, I think also from the arts and crafts position, it makes a lot of sense to go back and really look at what is the initial idea of why do you do art. We're doing now the museum for the Lascaux caves in France. Paintings 30,000 year old. Why were they actually painted? You know, there is an, like you said, intimacy between why you produce art and the public. The public is not the enemy of art. You don't have to hide it from the public. You don't have to put it away in shrines. And Europe has, like you said, a lot to learn from this, say, interactivity, contextuality between nature, humans, and the exhibited pieces. And if we can make that happen without having to draw the walls, basically, then we're in a totally different position of how museums could look in the future. And I totally agree. But I believe that in a lot of senses when it comes to architecture per se, because I think we're so restricted in our enclosure of architecture, the way we perceive it per as today. So that's why we did the roof of the Opera House in Oslo, part of the public space. So in effect, you walk on the roof, you use the site twice. One is free, open, without any commercial involvement. You can't even buy a cup of coffee, you know. No cappuccino on the roof, if you know what I'm saying. But inside, you're part of the performance of the opera. I think it belongs to a lot of cultural institutions, not only museums, this fact.
So we're going to open it up to questions in a minute, but clearly there's a shift going on. I'm very encouraged by our dialogue because it seems like architects at least are absorbing some very profound ideas that are moving us away from this rather pedantic presentation of object and gallery upon gallery, and the museum that you're thinking about is clearly opening up to the world. What, if you can imagine 50 years from now when that unknown future is here, if we could see those museums, those boxes or whatever they will be, what would surprise us the most about them?
I think this, if everything goes well,
if everything goes, if we're still alive.
I think this will be places where people meet, where people are not obliged to see the exhibition or something. Just museums should be places, as you mentioned, your opera house is, I think, a perfect example. You are not obliged to visit the opera performance. And the same is right for museums. They just should be places where people can meet and stroll around and get in touch with art and other things. That would be the best thing. And of course, we are always talking about the future of the next 500 museums. But what goes on with all these 3,000 museums built in the last years? That would be the most interesting question to analyze. What kind of buildings are there, and what are they going to do with these buildings?
Well, in my vision, it would be like when you walk into a museum, it's like visiting your neighbors, and you get into their house, and while having tea, and someone bring out the best collection of scrolls of paintings and unfold it for you, and it's like it's not like really going to some place, and so it's like very naturally integrated with your life.
I don't know if I would be surprised by anything really, but let's say that democracies have tried to define architectural typologies, or within the sense of democracy. I don't think we've managed, like all other political systems who have a very strong urban architectural relationship to their politics, I don't think democracies have yet found architectural typologies suitable for their politics. So the best hope I could have, at least, is that architecture is more in line with the human rights basically in the future, and that they are aligned with the equality of human society. And that means it's an interactive social space, obviously.
Well, in the spirit of interaction and open dialogue, a few questions. Is there a microphone that's rolling, perhaps? And what I'd like you to ask, if possible, just say who you are, and if you're from an institution, not that you have to be, say that as well. We don't have signal.
Okay, Hendrik Thieben from Chinese University of Hong Kong. I have one, two observations and a question. One thing is that now we hear about how the art of the museum comes from Europe to States to Asia. I don't agree necessarily with this. When we see actually the most successful strategist in terms of Western museums was Ian Pei, and he was a Chinese American, right? And he built basically for all the big capitals of the German, the different democracies, and everybody without even competition taking him as an architect. So probably with this Chinese wisdom of strategy, very interesting. I see more. I think I found that Yang Zhao's contribution, I think, was for me the most maybe closest to what I sense here in the area. I mean, when we talk at the moment, mainland China, of course, is maybe restrained for big, maybe the relationship of politics and museums. But if we look at Japan and Taiwan, I mean, we see a lot of very vibrant culture and exactly those very intimate relationships between culture and buildings and so on that can really blossom from basically work with communities and so So I think that I see really much more the future there, and I see also Rem Koolhaas projects, the second one maybe, or the one for the cultural district here, maybe much more trying to, after CCTV, maybe to get this atmosphere here in Hong Kong, because also Hong Kong is maybe goes much more, I think, on the streets and so on, much more in this direction. Also, I think there's maybe one question to young Zhao. I agree that I like this intimacy, but of course, when we talk about public space, which is also a great, is an important part, as we heard from contemporary museums, where is the experience of the other that is also in the museum? Could that be combined with this kind of very personal art collector that share with somebody else? Because the experience of the other, I think, is in the museum also, or in the public space, is very important. So how does that work together? Because some of these other museums, they are really this kind of very bold, open spaces where everybody meet. Is that possible if it's a family or very, very... And the second thing is maybe if you see at the moment already in mainland China, apart from the kind of top-down big things, not also, are there already signs for this kind of more smaller scale, other kind of museum? Or I think they are there, but how would you comment on this?
Versus, thank you. For the first question, I think it's possible to combine this public sense of space with that very private enjoyment in front of piece of art. And for me, I think to look at art and inspired by it is still very personal. And however public the building could be, it's always about you and the art. And another thing is that you create a space, it's very pleasant. In between your confrontation or encountering the art, you always meet people. So this is the quality of this public space. There's still these occasions or inspirations, or even this space can be pleasant enough to encourage this encountering between people. So I think this can work very well with the very private encountering with art. So this is one question. The other question is that you mentioned those...
the small museums, where you begin to see this.
I think there are emerging small museums, emerging small sponsors or and developers trying to make new small museums, and they are working better than those big government-funded museums. For example, there's a small museum in Chengdu, which is designed by an architect called Liu Jiakun. It's a museum with a very nice atmosphere, with very nice Buddhist statues exhibited there. It has a fantastic atmosphere, and I think that, and also that fits the ideal, what I described in the previous conversation, that there's a relationship between the interior and the exterior, between the nature and the very controlled space to look at art. So I think there are more and more these good examples, and I think it is possible for architects to do that when you realize it.
We had a question over here, the lady.
Yes, my name is Zhao Ying. I'm the curator of Chinese art at Art Gallery of New South Wales. So I'm actually the client side of the architects on the platform. I worked I worked in museums in China and in Singapore and in US and now in Sydney. But one thing I want to make a couple of statements here is I think when we're talking about museum, the first thing is the definition of the museum. A museum is different from exhibition space. Museum, the core of a museum is a collection. So without a collection, how do you show, how do you exhibit? And in order to show the exhibit, you got to preserve the exhibition, the collection. So I think when the architect, I do hope, because in the museum I'm working on, we have problems, as Mr. Schütz said, is empty box is the ideal thing. Like for curators and for exhibitors, we can change the exhibition. That's the public's purpose or the expectations. You can't frequently change. And also the preservation is important. And also in the other reminder I want to have is the difference between the Western Museum and the Chinese Museum. Western museums comes from the civil movement in the West since French Revolution. But whether China is ready for that kind of public engagement of the museum, that totally depends on the political change of China.
Do you have a question?
I do have a question. Last one is, I wondered when the architects look for building a museum, how much have they taken into consideration of renovate old buildings? We are living in a world, it's very wasteful. There are many good examples in the world, especially in China, there are so many old buildings, old factories. Instead of making a big statement of building a brand new museum, I wondered, how these architects think about how to renovate old buildings into modern, museums.
You have done one.
Yeah,
we've done a
the
pretty big
biggest
one.
museum in China is more or less a renovation project. It is the extension of a museum which is built in 1959, 10 years after the foundation of the People's Republic, and you can imagine that this was a very sensitive task because it is located on the Tiananmen Square, so at the very center of Beijing, and we had lots of discussions how to renovate this building, and we ended up with a complete restoration of the facades and parts of the interior, and we had also lots of discussions how to extend this building because this extension is rather big, and our concept was that the extension should be clearly visible, that it's an extension done in the beginning of our century, but it should reflect and mirror some elements of the old museum. So it's a very moderate renovation project in the end. It's not an iconic building at all, and I think this is maybe could be an example for many other projects in China.
Unless there's another a lady in the front and then a gentleman back there.
Good morning. I'm Maria. I'm an architect. I practice in Macau, which is just in the other side of the river. And I would say that I live inside a museum city because it has 500 years of history, and the city center, as you know, is classified by UNESCO. So we don't have a big museum there. I would say we have small museums. Even me, I did some renovation of old houses. Actually, they are museums. And we have, living in the city, we visit all these museums. And as an architect, I think that it's natural to preserve it and to go ahead, even the renovation, including the renovation of some of the old buildings, providing new spaces for people to learn about history, about showing new pieces of art, and so on. But the pressure of the development is too big, and some of the buildings, they will be demolished in the future. And the big argument of the government is they will have new reclamations, and also they do inquiries to the people, and the people there, it seems that some of them want to have a big museum, a representative, an iconic building, and this and that. So what would be your advice to deal with this question? Because I think that should be preserved. More people think that should be demolished and make an iconic building. And they are both Occidental and Oriental, because Macau is mixed culture, as you know, especially for Zhang.
So you're asking architects to tell you how to not to make
yes,
buildings.
Yes, because he said that he has also his own feeling about the situation.
Yeah.
And we are balancing just
So
ideas
anybody
and
have
judgment.
thoughts on this?
Well, first of all, I'm very sympathetic to this situation. I mean, I mean, it's almost a question to a mayor, I guess. But in terms of from the point of view of an architect, I guess, well, what I can think of is a very good example in Boston. You know, there's a very elegant private museum called Isabella Stewart Garden Museum. It's almost a building demolished in Venice and moved piece by piece to Boston and put up again. And all those collections collected by that lady have been there for more than 100 years. Yeah, more than 100 years. And I think with a very well maintenance and with very careful organization of what's going on with this contemporary culture, because they have these regular discussions in the museum. They have these small concerts happening very regularly. So you can always keep this thing very alive, even if you have only this very old building. For me, it's
well,
always
it didn't
not
hurt that she has the most extraordinary collection of art in the northern United States.
Yeah, well, I mean, the point is that building itself is not that important. I have to mention it again. I think it's about how to put the intelligence to create this environment of appreciation of art. If you achieve that, people will forget what is the iconic building. That's actually very boring.
We have time for
Maybe I should
sorry.
just give you one sort of general advice that we've used in Røros, which is up in the middle part of Norway. If there wasn't the money to preserve the whole building institutions, we advise the clients to use a little bit of money to preserve one bit of the building extraordinarily well. So when they came in and wanted to take it away, this particular bit was the argument for not doing it. Mm-hmm. And it actually helped with a little less economy. You could actually preserve things that were almost falling apart by maintaining one core element extraordinarily well.
I'd like to ask the remaining questions to go as quickly as possible to the questions, just in the interest of time. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Lawrence Liao from consultancy practice Sparta. I have two very, very short questions. Firstly, to Stephan and, sorry, I don't know how to pronounce your name. Kjetil.
Yeah.
As you well know, having worked in China on museums for so long, most of the short list of the so-called important museums, they're mostly non-Asian or non-Chinese firms, and that's been a very hot debate. And then you spend the next 6 months, or in my case, I worked on one as well, the next 18 months listening to the curators telling you should be more Chinese. You need to understand culture, but then the short list is completely non-Chinese. So I'm just wondering what your experience is, whether you've had similar experiences, what you think about this kind of dichotomy, and also the kind of debate that's surrounding this within Chinese museum practice. That's the first question. And second question is directed to Yang Zhao, or Zhao Yang. Your comment, I love the comment about civilized. I think in Chinese you mean Wenming, right? Wenming.
Well, yes,
Wenming, because
exactly.
in every city you see Wenming, Chengshi, etc. Wenming means civilized. So I'm just wondering whether you think this kind of drive to be so-called quote-unquote civilized as a reaction to the other kind of cultural movement that happened in 1966. A redemption for 1966. This kind of drive towards civilization.
So let's just quickly get to this issue, which is a big issue, clearly. What do our European guests have to say about the fact that it's mainly non-Chinese architects that gets shortlisted? That was your first question?
They're constantly bombarded with pressure to be more Chinese.
Right.
During the kind of design process.
I think it's impossible to be more Chinese or less Chinese or to become Chinese. I'm working in China for more than 20 years, and I'm not Chinese at all. But I like to listen to the people, and I like to get to know what they think, what their requirements, their intentions are, and therefore, it's, as I said, it's a matter of dialogue. It's not a matter of becoming more Chinese, and it's not only about the culture you are working for. It's also about the building typology. If I have to build a railway station, I have to listen to the people who know how railway stations work and what is going on in a railway station. And so it's all a matter of dialogue. The success of a project is the result of a good conversation, a good exchange.
I think I have to say we haven't done any projects in China, not one. But it's important to say that when we work abroad, outside of Norway, we always work with local companies that are located in the places where we work. And similarly now also for the pre-qualification of the M+, we always work with architectural practices which are located where we work together. So that would be part of the architectural and cultural exchange that you would do anywhere in the world. Even when we design in Sweden, we would do that, you know.
Do you have an answer to?
As a question for me, it's about civilization. It's what's the last part of your sentence, please?
You know what? I suggest you guys have this conversation after the panel because you need to understand what the question is. So I'm going to take one last question from there.
My name is Polina Kolczynska, and I'm a strategic advisor to Grażyna Kulczyk Art Stations Foundation in Poland. Gentlemen, we've heard today about the historical, cultural perspective, also political one. However, and here is the, let's say, in the spirit of the art historian, I'm going to ask you, don't you think that in finding certain solution, let's say, in showing and bringing certain artistic ideas to our societies, and here I'm looking in a broad manner, simply, let's say, human beings of 21st, 22nd century, that possibly the starting point of creating an architecture, suitable environment, will be in fact the artwork itself, the nature of this artwork. And here, following, for example, the let's say, spirit and the trail of thought of Mr. Thorsen, I would say let's say, possible solution of something, of an architectural creation which would be a home for art, not created. I think that here possibly we could summon the educational aspect of the museum and its place in the society. In order to create a suitable environment to support ideas and at the same time translate these ideas into our societies. In regards to the, let's say, kind standpoint of Mr. Young Zhao, I would say, yes, it is our understanding that obviously Chinese culture prefers a certain environment to do with the nature. However, even, let's say, observing progress of the cinematography in Chinese animation, for example, this would be an example of the artwork which not necessarily is going to be able to shown in conjunction with nature, for example. So as a result, of course, we have to accommodate the artwork itself in order to create a space which ultimately is going to help us to enhance what the artwork is bringing us in regards to the progress in our societies. I'm sorry about this very, very long...
we get it. Thank you. So I just wanted, do you have a reflection on this? Because then after this we're going to be going soon. So reflection on what you just said?
Maybe just on the collections of museums. Yes, you're right, obviously. I mean, your starting point is the art. But then again, there is a sort of generative contradiction in this, which is kind of beautiful. So why let things sort of just be happy, go happy every day when it comes to museums? Why isn't there a generative resistance being accepted in the way you actually design art spaces, let's say, where the art actually is resisting the architecture and the other way around. So I think there is, yes, there is something coming from this perspective for sure. But I don't necessarily believe that that is the only way forward when we talk about art that is not yet produced. Two different things.
Well, today we covered quite a lot of ground for a very short period of time. I think we raised a lot of issues about the responsibilities of architecture, the possibilities of architecture. I think we gradually got rid of everything, the present, the context, the box, but somehow we landed at a very interesting place of possibility about where museums may go in the future. As we prepare to leave, I just in closing wanted to ask each of you super briefly, if there's one big message that you feel comes out of this conversation that you feel should inform those next 500, those next 1,000 museums in this part of the world, what would it be? I'll start with you.
Well, learning from the others, not from myself this time, but I think intimacy is really a huge point. What you can touch, what you can walk on, can belong to you in a way. Mm-hmm. What is distant and doesn't have this intimacy can never become public ownership. Mm-hmm. So I think intimacies in particular relationships are very, very important, and I take that further.
Yeah?
I would say the disappearance of boundaries would be the word for me.
Stephan, last word for you.
The way you use a building should be, you don't know what's going on with a building in 10 years or 50 years. So think about the building that it can gather many different uses, not only collections. Could be something else in the future. That's what I think a museum should be.
Well, thank you very much to our speakers. Thank you for coming. Enjoy the fair. Bye-bye.